This is continuing coverage. The Black Swan murder trial of Ashley Benefield from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Now back to the courtroom.
All right, welcome back, everyone. It's after lunch in 2020 CF 3014. Is the jury up? All right, jury's being brought up. Anything we need to talk about before the defense calls their next witness? Oh, I'm so sorry. I was looking right over top. Oh, you know, it's a good point. Check and see if this thing's working. All right, looks like my real-time viewer is working again. All right, welcome back, everybody. It's after lunch now. We're all back in 2020 CF 3014. Is there anything we need to talk about before the defense calls its next witness? All right, as soon as the jury comes up, let me know and we'll bring them on in. Okay. All right, y'all can sit down. Welcome back, everybody. As we were breaking, I saw some folks got new pads of paper, and everybody's pen is still doing okay. All right, just let know if not. I hope you had a good lunch. Did anybody discuss the case amongst yourselves? Talk about the case with anybody outside of this group, or do any research on people, places, legal topics, or get any information about it? He says no. All right, Mr. Taylor, call your next witness.
Thank you. Why defense calls Justin Warren.
I do.
Thank you. Just make yourself comfortable in that chair. Get about 15 inches from the microphone. Just up, down, left, right, however you need. Loud, clear voice, and we'll hear everything.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead and approach.
Good afternoon, sir. Yes, sir.
What does that mean?
The way that our unit works, the Manatee Homicide Investigative Unit, the lead essentially during a homicide investigation is elevated to essentially almost the rank, not a sergeant, but basically has some of the same responsibilities as far as handing out assignments and then collecting the information at the end.
And
We do collect everything at the end, but we do have meetings, so everybody's pretty much aware of what's going on. We work as a group, so like I said, it's pretty much a group effort.
Recall, yes, following question. Okay, so part of responsibility is that not answer sure.
The answer is still sure. Yes, sir.
You want your investigation, especially homicide,
Yes, sir.
with conclusions.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Not
That's correct.
Not some nature of homicide shell on a judge.
That's correct.
Did you submit an arrest affidavit, Ms.
Objection.
Benefield? Yes, what?
Ruled at this point.
Did you submit an arrest affidavit, Ms. Benefield?
Yes, sir.
Did you represent that?
Sustained.
Describe.
Go ahead and ask questions.
Was your position that based on not his face shot?
Based on what I knew, yes.
And as it relates to that?
Well, whenever we have a homicide investigation, one of our detectives will go to the medical examiner's office for the examination and obtain a preliminary finding. We don't actually receive the medical examiner's report for several months to maybe even a year in some cases.
Where that shot?
Sustained.
As it related to wound of the leg, what basis?
I'm sorry.
As it related to wound of the leg, what basis?
It appeared that he was shot from the right side of his body. I wouldn't say so, but I'm not a doctor. I would ask the doctor.
So your position sit here today that not shot.
That's not the way that it appeared when we did our preliminary investigation with the medical examiner and then later on.
Members of the jury, we're going to need a couple extra minutes to handle this. And if I could ask you to step out, close up your note, step back in the jury room, we'll get you back at as soon as you can. Remember, don't begin deliberations, talk with anybody about the case, or do any research on people, places, things, or legal topics. All right, sir. We're going to need to address legal matter. So I'm going to ask you to step out of the hallway. The rule of sequestration has been invoked, so you're not questions asked you or your testimony to anyone. Talk with other witnesses about their testimony.
Yes, sir.
All right, the witness is out. So as I understand it, there's going to be several areas of cross-examination regarding Detective Warren, and the state has objected on the long-standing doctrine that you can't call a witness solely to impeach that witness. So that's where we're at, and the line of question where we stopped was going to involve statements made by the detective in his probable cause affidavit or arrest affidavit. All right, so these issues were addressed, and I seem to recall that I allowed these at the stand your ground hearing, and this may have been the footnote where I said rulings at trial may be different. And there's also been a pre-trial motion regarding impeachment of Detective Warren and what is relevant and material and admissible. And I said, I believe my ruling was that he would have shown at the time of the cross, or the direct and the attempted impeachment, to show that those criteria are met. So, State, what else did you want to put on the record?
Judge, only that this happened in our litigation about this issue, so would not have this problem in the middle of trial. Now almost every sentence out of Mr. Taylor's mouth, I have to object because he is not following your rule or the rules of evidence. So I would ask that we try to get this ironed out now so we don't have to call the witness back and I have to object. He has clearly only called this witness at a first.
All right, I called this witness, established substantive evidence. I asked him, what does being the lead detective on a case mean? Is that the one who has the most knowledge of the case? Do you develop a theory of the case? He resisted that. I impeached him with prior acknowledgement. He then also said and confirmed that he would want his investigation to be objective, fair, with conclusions supported by evidence, not speculation, and that it's not something that you jump to conclusions on. Now, that is my substantive evidence, and based on that alone, if nothing else, I am now allowed to argue the jury, don't you think it's strange that a lead detective on a homicide case not be called as a witness on behalf of the state? So that's my supposition. Along the way, I should be also likewise entitled to impeach him. For example, he has testified that he would not want to jump to conclusions on a murder case. You wanted the objective, fair conclusions supported by evidence, not speculation. All right, fine. Is it not true that within an hour and a half of this shooting, you referred to this as murder? I then want to ask him, do you believe all homicides are murders? If he says yes, good. If he says no, then I plan to impeach him because he made that statement in his deposition. I then want to ask him, and do you believe that all people who kill are murderers? If he says yes, fine. If he denies it, then I plan to impeach him because he made that statement in his deposition. I don't see why that is not fair game. Respectfully. The only other question I had of him was he had authored a supplemental report on November 16, 20, and in that supplemental report there is a provision on the report for bias referring to the subject, Ashley Benefield, and he checked the box, or either checked the box or wrote in no bias. I plan to ask about that.
And what report is that?
That is a report that he authored a supplemental on November 16th, 2020, and referring to Ashley Benefield as it relates to the victim, Douglas Benefield. He wrote or checked the box that says no bias.
What are the other options?
Well, the other options are hate, spite, ill will, and
on that form?
No, the form it's an open form. It's for him to put it in there. Here, I'll show the court the form. It says bias motivation, he types in no bias. The next block says bias target, blank, and the box after that says bias circumstance. That too is left blank. Now, I tell the court in deposition, Detective Warren questioned whether or not he had filled that form out, despite the fact that it's got his name typed on it. That's going to be a question of fact for the jury. Go to its credibility, not its dismissal. Respect.
All right, the line, thank you. The line of questioning that you seem to be starting with was the line of questioning that the stand your ground hearing where a narrative was established and then I believe it was shared with the state and then there were some amendments and then it was shared with the state and then there were some amendments, I think, to final form.
All I proposed to ask him here was to write a witness. It has been dealt with a box, and I want to ask him if he knew who that witness was, and he's going to tell me it was Benefield. Then I'm going to ask him why he'd say that. Give us a reason why you would not have disclosed that rather than witness.
This was supposed to be shown to the court outside of the presence of a pre-termination for the jury count. I would like to know the relevance of what is his arrest affidavit. He cannot call a witness to the stand and say do a thorough and fair investigation just so he can impeach him with this stuff that he's trying to get in. He calls him and says these questions and calls them substantive evidence. It's not substantive evidence. It is setting him up so he get in all of these items that he thinks are. We have gone over this before, that what is in this arrest affidavit is irrelevant. What the judge signed the arrest affidavit. You said in your pretrial order that the use of the word murder versus homicide, my motion was granted unless this defendant can establish to the court why this is relevant. And the defense did not say anything different than what they said before. We argue also any edits of a warrant or search warrant or anything in the warrant, same thing. So I really don't understand why we're back here arguing this again. The arguments are exactly the same. Calls this witness, asks questions to set up. And it is disingenuous to say that this witness is called for any substantive other than attacking his credibility. He was never a witness. Why is he attacking the credibility of a witness that never testified?
So as I understood the court, until such time as I could demonstrate relevance homicide is not innocent. I think relevance of lead detective believing that all homicides are murders is overwhelming relevant.
Please explain. I understand, and you said that multiple times in multiple hearings. Relevant to prove what?
Bias. This guy executes a search warrant within 45 minutes of the shooting, referring to it not as a homicide, but as a murder. We've already had testimony from at least 2 deputies, and in particular, I'll remind the court of Lieutenant, I believe it was Dickerman, who testified that not all homicides are murders, that the reason you have to take time to investigate a homicide is to determine whether or not there's been criminality. So here's the lead detective who initiates the theory of the case. Within 45 minutes, he's calling it a murder rather than a homicide, and he makes the statement that all homicides are murders and anybody who kills is a murderer, and the court is going to instruct the jurors, if you feel her action was justified, then she's not guilty, because not all homicides are crimes. How could that not be relevant?
Was never testified.
Any further thoughts?
No.
All right. Yeah, these we've already covered this ground. So it answered a question just a moment ago about what was the purpose for calling this witness, and the law is very clear, and I think both sides know this area of the law. You cannot call a witness solely to impeach that witness. Asking if that person is the lead detective, is it important to be fair and objective? Is it important to rely on facts? Is it important not to engage in speculation or jump to conclusions? Those are not substantive questions regarding the investigation. Those are just general questions to someone about being objective and fair. In this particular situation, and I'm skipping over the part about any argument about the state not calling the lead detective in a case. I'll leave that to whenever it's presented. I think we all know the law on that as well. But the answer I got is, what is the relevance of him referring to, in a search warrant within an hour and a half, a murder? What's the relevance of his opinion? This is an opinion. Are all homicides murders? That's an opinion. It doesn't matter what he thinks. If he thinks that all homicides are murders, or all murders are homicides, or there's some mix of the two of them, that's a jury question that the jury is going to have to answer. I can't think of any witness I would let speculate or testify as to whether this case is a homicide or a justifiable homicide or an excusable homicide. That's the province of the jury.
Judge Kemp, may I ask?
I tried to give both sides as much time as they wanted to put information on the record. The question, are all people who kill murderers? Again, what I'm asking is, what's the relevance of that to show his bias? There hasn't been anything established that he was particularly biased in any way, or how that would be relevant to this particular case when it's an opinion whether people who are kill or murderers. That's going to be a jury question to decide whether the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt its allegations of murder in the second degree with a firearm, or if the facts and evidence support a lesser included offense, or if the state has not met its burden and the defendant is not guilty, whether they haven't met their burden or because the jury believes and finds that the defendant has acted in lawful self-defense. The other issue about the statements made in the probable cause affidavit, it's my understanding that it's going to be asked is, did you know who that witness is? And again, I'm struggling to understand how that is relevant into any particular issues in this case.
How about this? Does the court think as lead homicide, Justin Warren would have said, I'm not going to seek a search warrant because I think Ashley Benefield was abused and I think her actions were justified? That would be his opinion. But if that was his opinion, she might not be sitting here right now. That's why I think it's relevant. He initiated the prosecution, and you were hearing from somebody who initiated the prosecution who is overwhelmingly biased. He acted impetuously. He acted without evidence. He got both of the entry wound wrong. He completely speculated that Mr. Benefield was not facing her when she was shot. Their own medical examiner said he was facing her.
Mr. Taylor, I am certainly giving you as much room as I can to cross and impeach on relevant and material issues. But from what I've heard so far, and I will just say that the impeachment from earlier regarding theory of the case, that was not materially different. But so far, the questions you have asked and the questions that I've heard you represent to me and issues that you intend to represent and question this witness on are all impeachment issues.
All right, I have two questions the court allowed me to ask them. One question is I want to ask him if he spoke with the medical examiner before he submitted arrest warrant. And last question is, did you fill out this supplemental report and indicate lies? That's it. Then the only thing left is I want to show him DNA or every sections out. Gave that business arrest.
Well, hold on.
Okay.
The two questions that have been stated at this point, the two questions, just to try and get objections out of the way and get them ruled on so we can get this going, is one, two is this supplemental report, nothing regarding bias. And the first thing again?
And the first one was, did you speak with the medical examiner before you submit arrest warrant? I think he's already testified to that.
I think he did.
None of it is,
All right.
and I will be asking.
All right. And then you wanted to show him
The
DNA report.
Yeah, he submitted his got back.
All right. I don't know if I've seen that.
May not have. Show.
What is the relevance of showing a detective a DNA?
Hold on. Yeah, plus it's a report. It's not been authenticated.
Gave them notice of the business record. They did not file objection to it, and it shows that court may call a crime scene swab, both Spencer's hands, wrists, forearm, and DNA came back. Douglas Spencer, potential contributor, and court may recall Benefit on stand that she attempted to flee the house. Mr. Benefit ran after her, grabbed her, spun her around, and blocked her so she couldn't get out.
Yeah, but it's okay. Go ahead.
My objections are not to the business record certification judge. My objection is the contents of the report there has not been a foundation laid to make that report relevant. There has not been a witness that testified that swabs were taken and then turned over. There's not a witness that said, I'm speaking. There's not a witness who says that those swabs were taken from Ashley Benefield and then those swabs were sent to DNA labs. So anything contained in that report that says there's DNA from Doug Benefield or Ashley Benefield is hearsay. There is not a person at DNA labs that can say where those swabs came from. They all they know is they got them from the sheriff's office and somebody told them where they came from. And I think that the probative value is outweighed by the prejudice because it's going to confuse the jury. It's a packet with bench notes and the report. And the report, there's no witness here to testify to explain a very complicated report. This isn't, even ballistics is somewhat simple. This is DNA. It's extremely complicated. And I think that the danger is that it will confuse the jury and that the proper foundation has not been laid. So my objections are not to the business records, which is why we did not file an objection. It is to the contents being hearsay. There's an insufficient foundation to enter this and that there's a unfair prejudice.
I'm quite comfortable relying on the court's notes, and if the court checks its notes under Megan Dorvac, the court will see that Megan Dorvac testified after being called by the state that she swabbed at the sheriff's office that evening Ashley Benefield's hands, arms, and forearms for DNA evidence, and I even specifically asked her if the purpose of that was to be able to determine who may have touched her on that occasion. She agreed. Now, Warren submitted those DNA samples to the lab. The lab returned those DNA samples to Warren. Now, I'm going to ask him what the result was. And I have the DNA report for the court if it would like to see it along with the business certification records of the custodian.
I've seen plenty of them. All right, anything else?
No, Judge, that's not how any of this works. There's been no swabs. There was no witness that said, these are the swabs I took from Ashley Benefield. There's been no witness that said, these are the same swabs that were sent to DNA labs. There's been no witness that said, those are the swabs I received. There's been no establishment that anything in that report is related to this case based on anything other than hearsay. I'm sorry, Judge, I already said all those things. But it's just frustrating because all the steps to get that report in under certified business records have been skipped. And so although I don't object to that portion of it, it's the contents being hearsay and improper.
As a proponent, I'll give you the final word, and I need to make a ruling.
Well, just say the state never filed any objection. We gave them notice plenty of time.
Yeah, this is a really easy call. That lab report is not admissible. You could call the DNA analyst who could come in under 9702 and establish the foundation and the bases to admit DNA evidence. After the chain of custody has been established, there's been no evidence. I haven't heard anything at all about I heard about swabs. I don't recall seeing the swabs. I heard about swabbing being done. But then the chain of custody, getting them to whatever lab did the testing to ensure the integrity of the evidence. Then at the lab, what are the testing processes, procedures, known error rates, all of the foundations you would need under 90.702 and 703, 704, 705 about how this all happens. And then, of course, we need the analyst to explain what these results are. So that lab report doesn't come in. In addition, it's prepared in anticipation of litigation. I mean, that's the whole reason it's done. So that one, that was an easy one. That is going to be prohibited, crossing Warren on the DNA report. The other two, though, the state objects. I think it's fair to ask Detective Warren if he spoke with the medical examiner before he sought an arrest warrant. And you can ask him, I think, if that's his supplemental report. I think it's close, but I'll let you ask him, here in this box regarding bias, nothing is there. But out of everything I've heard, those are the only two questions that I think are relevant and material and appropriate of everything we've talked about and aren't solely to impeach. So, all right, let's.
Judge, I would just ask to establish the without bias part without speaking out loud jury part.
I don't understand what that means.
He's leading this witness and speaking what's on the report before the witness even says he wrote it. So I
Right,
would
so
prefer that he
establish if it's his report, establish that down on, right here, there's a box that says a bias. What does that mean to you? And he left it blank, and is there anything in particular that why he did that? But that's the extent of what I've heard relevant, so let's bring it back in. All right, sir, did you speak with anybody about your testimony, or did anybody approach you to speak with you? Did you talk with other witnesses about their testimony, questions asked?
No, sir.
Research on the case, watch it at all?
No, sir.
All right, let's go ahead and bring- All right, y'all can have a seat. Welcome back, everybody. Did you begin deliberating amongst yourselves? Talk with anybody outside the jury about the case? Or do any research on people, places, things, or legal topics? Everybody says no. You may resume your direct exam.
Thank you. Detective Warren, did you speak with the medical examiner yourself before you submitted your arrest warrant in this case?
Like I said earlier, we have a detective that will go to the scene or to the medical examiner's office to get the preliminary findings.
Repeat my question. Did you personally speak with the medical examiner or seek your arrest warrant in this case?
Not that I can recall.
Yeah, do you see fresh recollection?
Sure. Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah, so I spoke to him on October 29th in reference to stippling. Yes, sir.
All right, my last question. Do you recall filling out a supplement on 6 of that?
I filled out a lot of reports, sir. May I look at it just to verify?
Sure.
Okay.
Is that your report?
It appears to be. Yes, sir.
All right, tell us the date.
November 16th at 15:10 hours. Yes, sir.
All right, yeah,
It's a program that's got a lot of different stuff, so there could be possibly, sure.
all right, this bias donation.
Okay.
Put it on.
Well, it would have just been not filled out. It auto-populates. Like I said, it's a program, and I'm not a programmer, so I apologize.
So, where bias, ill will, spite, evil intent, things of that nature, no, did you not?
Honestly, it probably would have been just documented in the report.
Go for it.
Cross.
This section that says bias for crime.
Yes, ma'am. When we fill out certain areas for certain crimes, it's required for statistical reporting and things, and a lot of things that I'm not even aware of. I don't typically pay attention to that box. But
So this box is for those kind of statistics, not for any kind of bias that may be going on.
correct.
Thank you.
Redirect.
Objection beyond the scope.
Sustain. Can this witness be released?
Yeah.
Remain anonymous, sir. I gave you about a minute. No, sir, you can go, but you
Okay.
need to be available.
Yes, sir. They have my email. Thank you.
Call your next witness.
We call Michael Hay.
I do. Thanks, sir. Judge White, right in. Make yourself comfortable in that chair. Get about 12 in that mic. Up, down, left, right. Just get louder.
Thanks, sir.
Good afternoon. Will you tell us your full name, spell your last name?
My name is Michael Haig, H-A-A-G.
What type of work, Mr. Hay?
I'm involved in forensics. Specifically, a typical job title would be forensic scientist.
Let's talk about your educational background. Where'd you go to school?
My formal education is as a chemist. I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in chemistry from the University of Arizona in Tucson with a math physics minor.
When you speak of forensics, what are we referring to?
Forensics in the broad scope simply means the junction or the joining of science and the law. So it's where somebody who is particularly interested in or has been trained to examine physical evidence brings findings or an interpretation of that physical evidence into the courtroom.
Could you describe your forensic career history?
My background and training is fairly unique in that I grew up in this field. My dad, Luke Haig, also does this kind of work. So even in grade school, I'd go out and assist him with both casework and research, and I got the bug. So after I went to college and got my degree, I went and worked for a private consulting firm that he ran for about 2 years or so. followed by an application and employment with the Albuquerque Police Department Crime Laboratory, starting in about 1998. With APD, I worked for about 25 years and got to the retirement point and was able to retire. But during that same time frame, I also ran my own private company, specializing in my sort of primary area of interest in forensics, which is shooting incident reconstruction. The study of the physical evidence relating to shootings, the interpretation of that physical evidence, and the reporting on it, of course. With the Police Department Crime Laboratory, I wore quite a few hats. Primarily, I worked as a firearm and tool mark examiner, which someone in that role particularly focuses on the physical evidence relating to those things. But I also worked in drug chemistry, as well as blood and breath alcohol, and was a supervisor of those units for about 12 years as well.
Any additional training and or classes that you take in order to be skill shop?
The list is fairly long. Honestly, I don't remember everything that I list on my CV. But as far as training and expertise, I've been trained and taken classes from everything from the FBI at Quantico to doing cross trainings with the San Diego Police Department, in-house training with the Albuquerque Police Department. I regularly attend conferences and seminars. I worked for the German Bundeskriminalamt, spell it, Bundeskriminalamt, which is like their FBI. So I interned with them for a while before I came to the Albuquerque Crime Laboratory, and a wide variety of other trainings I've received over the almost 30 years now.
Are you a member of a professional organization?
I am. The ones that are particularly relevant to what I do would be the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners, or AFTE, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. EMFC is one that I've been a member of for about 2 or 3 years. That's the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes. They actually have some very, very interesting perspectives on forensics, among others, including the Association for Crime Scene Reconstruction. But that's another bug I got from my dad, is being very active in the field, seeing how other units do things, as well as participating in those conferences.
Have you authored or published any scientific papers?
Quite a few. Another bug I got from my dad. I publish very regularly in scientifically reviewed, peer-reviewed journals, such as the Journal of Forensic Sciences, the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners Journal, amongst others.
Written any textbook?
Luke, my dad, and I wrote a textbook, one of the few on shooting incident reconstruction. It's in its 3rd edition now, and I'm also the author of a chapter in the Encyclopedia of Forensic Sciences on shooting incident reconstruction.
And how about, Mr. Haig, any forensic presentation?
I very regularly present, both at conferences as well as for organizations, on this area of work.
Tell us what certification or firearms certification hours.
The primary certifications, which certification applies to an individual and accreditation applies to a laboratory, so those are terms you'll often hear mixed, but certifications available and that are relevant to what I do include 3 from the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners, 1 in gunshot residue and distance determination, 1 in firearm identification, that's the examination of microscopic tool marks, as well as tool mark identification, the examination of microscopic tool marks from other things besides guns, like screwdrivers and hammers and things like that. And then when the International Association for Identification had a certification, they've discontinued it, for crime scene reconstruction as a whole, I applied for and took that. All these tests involve both the knowledge test as well as a practical examination. And the AFTE ones, which are still active, of course, require recurrent training and testing.
Have been recognized and testified as expert?
I have.
Approximately how many times?
At last count, I think I'm getting close to 100.
And where have you testified?
Primarily in the area where I worked for most of my 30 years in New Mexico, in Albuquerque. But in addition to that, all across the country, to include states like California, Texas, and Rhode Island, and I'm not sure if I've been to Florida before, but many, many states across the country, in courts ranging from district or regional courts, state courts, to federal courts, and military court martials.
Mr. Haig, have you given your opinion in high-profile cases?
I have. The cases that come to mind would be Aaron Hernandez in Boston. That was a high-profile homicide trial. I've been involved in the examination of physical evidence in places like Taiwan, even for presidential assassination attempts. I've worked cases from Iraq and many other places that I lose track of.
Are you an instructor in areas?
I am.
You've written on the subject as well?
I have.
And you provide regular training on shooting construction.
One of the areas that I actually gain a lot of pleasure from is instruction in shooting incident reconstruction. So this is the examination, as I said, an evaluation of any physical evidence when a shooting takes place. That can involve the crime scene itself, it can involve trajectories, it can involve a wide variety of things within that sort of umbrella title. but I've taught a shooting incident reconstruction course for almost the entire last 25, 26 years of my career. They're week-long live fire shooting courses. So this isn't just a thought process. I go out and shoot things so that people that do what I do, crime scene investigators, forensic scientists, even pathologists, can come and see how these shootings take place and understand what they're looking at when they go into a scene. So I do that very regularly, especially now that I'm retired. I'm able to do about 4 to 8 of those a year, it seems like.
Is the assessment of bullet trajectories taught in your SIR work?
It is.
Can you describe for us what a 3D laser scanner is?
This is a tool that I actually feel very lucky to have helped brought into the crime scene realm. It's an engineering tool, technically. But if you think of a laser rangefinder, a very simple one that you might aim at something, push the button, it shoots out a bullet of light. Light travels at a very consistent speed. So when that light is reflected back to the sensor, time is measured, and we then can calculate a distance because of that time and the known speed of the light. That's one bullet of light. A 3D laser scanner is an engineering tool that sits on a tripod and has such a thing inside of it, but spins in a 360-degree azimuth, left and right, and also is able to shoot out the laser beam in a vertical path as well. So imagine in this room shooting out millions of bullets of light and collecting individual data points on a very accurate scale and then blending all those individual data points together. You get a representation of reality. You get a computer takeaway of your scene, and then you move that system from one place to the next so you can move around corners and you can blend all of these data sets together so that you really take the crime scene with you. So I was lucky enough with my police department to help start this theft of this technology into crime scene back in about 2005, and since then many departments have also seen the value of it, particularly with trajectories in my opinion, and it's become a very common tool across the country and internationally as well for crime scene investigation and shooting reconstruction.
Mr. Haig, define for us what exactly a trajectory.
When I'm describing a trajectory, I like to think of it or describe it or liken it to a snapshot in time. If you imagine yourself in a dark room, completely dark, and things are moving, and you set off a strobe from a camera, let's say 3 times in that dark room while things are moving around, then you've really frozen things in place for that brief instant while the strobe was going off, or in our case, when a shot is going off, because bullets move to our perception of reality in a very fast manner, of course, and so if a bullet, say, goes through something and then strikes something else, it can help us orient those objects that are struck, and indeed then where the firearm is as well. So snapshot in time is how I tend to think of it, but it's a way of understanding where things were, including potentially the firearm itself, as well as objects that are struck.
All right, so come upon investigation, a shooting incident struck, correct?
I try to.
All right, now, would you tell us significant importance of trajectory as relates to that instruction?
In forensic science, you in very many ways have to throw out what you may have seen with regard to TV. Most of the things that TV puts out are completely false. But the beauty or interesting thing about trajectories with regard to shooting scenes is that fact that it gives us a way of assessing where things were in those moments of time. A person in my role may not be able to say exactly what happened in between them sometimes. Sometimes there's a logical progression of what might have happened given the physical evidence that we do have. But in my job, I basically lay the pieces of the puzzle on the table, meaning what physical evidence I have to look at from a shooting scene. That could be the projectiles, the cartridge casings, the firearm itself, or trajectories. The room, and then try and see what snapshots in time we may have available to rebuild.
Is there a distinction between what you're referring to trajectory and path?
Wound path is sort of a subset of trajectory. Wound path refers to, indeed, just that, the path a bullet took or created when it goes through a body part in specific, or a body. But in each case, the accuracy and the meaning of those trajectories can be evaluated because bullets, for the most part, there are exceptions, tend to travel in more or less straight paths. Like I said, there are absolutely exceptions to that, particularly with, we're not dealing with in this case, non-expanding rifle bullets, but we look at these paths as relatively linear. Every measurement taken by human beings is an approximation though, so an understanding of how much accuracy to place on those measurements and that documentation is absolutely, of course, important as well. With trajectories into things like walls, when I have good points to work with, or data from somebody's scan of a trajectory rod in place, for example, typically about plus or minus 5 degrees is what I've found from my work and what I would call an industry standard in my work around a measured trajectory, around a straight line, if you will, that was created by something like a trajectory rod. With wound paths, it can be a little more difficult, and this is something I've lectured on to not only the pathologists in my area, who I worked closely and well with and helped train when they'd come in as fellows, and that I've lectured on at the Swiss Wound Ballistics Workshop 2 years ago, I think, and was asked to lecture on, is the idea that not only are trajectories in bodies a little bit more inaccurate because of the way they're measured and how bodies move, we're not walls, we're not rigid, So we have to indeed look at those as a little bit more of an approximation. But for the most part, with things like we're looking at here, expanding handgun bullets, that category, we can describe them or think of them as relatively straight lines as documented. They give us an idea of where a firearm may have been at the time the shot was fired based on that path. So wound ballistics is a subset of just trajectory. They're related.
May have this, did I? My apologies. What is the Trial of Ashley structure?
With regard to common things that I typically deal with in crime scenes, like walls, sheet metal in cars, desks, almost anything you can think of, I shoot in my classes to demonstrate this and basically check ourselves and see how accurate we are, about plus or minus 5 degrees. So I'm motioning with my hands to make sort of an arc. So if my primary line of measurement, we're going right down the center of my wedge here, I'm making a visual representation of approximately plus and minus 5 degrees, a 10-degree cone overall if you rotate that into 3 dimensions. But I think I can show you that later.
What steps take in preparation?
When I do a case review such as this, there are materials that I typically would like to see in order to help inform myself on what evidence, what pieces of that puzzle are on the table to include, particularly documents, things like crime scene images, autopsy reports, lab reports, all the documentation that goes around a typical investigation, as well as 3D laser scan data, if it's available, amongst other things.
And in this case, you examine all the evidence.
I actually forgot to mention that. In addition to that, in this case, I did examine the actual physical evidence, meaning the projectiles, cartridge casings, etc.
I'm saying projectiles.
Correct.
All right. And this information provided by the county, correct? By the sheriff's office, crime scene?
Which information were you talking about?
That were able to preparation.
I think technically I received it through you, with the exception of the 3D laser scan data, meaning the documentation, the crime scene of photographs and autopsy reports.
Do you recall whether or not you actually came sheriff's office?
Absolutely.
All right. Let me ask you, with that preface, tell us please about the projectiles in this case.
The examination of the projectiles helped me understand in a way where they'd been. And this is sort of one of my main areas of interest, is the damage to projectiles, sometimes, depending on their condition when they finally come to rest, can tell us something about where they've been and what they've hit, especially if we're dealing with particular types of projectiles, such as we're dealing with in this case, which are expanding handgun bullets. This basically means that we're dealing with a construction that is designed to change shape if that projectile strikes something that is liquidy, and we are mostly liquid, so that would include tissue. A hollow point projectile is typically designed such that it has an external jacket made of copper. So my hands here are representing copper, and then that goes around it in 360-degree rotation. So in this demonstration, my fingers pointing up, that's the way the bullet would travel. A hollow point projectile has just indeed that, a hollow point cavity in the nose of the bullet, and it is designed that way such that if it's traveling stably, nose forward, and that hollow point cavity encounters something liquid, it could be a gallon of milk sitting on a countertop, doesn't matter, or tissue. The liquid actually goes into that hollow point cavity, and because the bullet is traveling forward, you build up hydraulic pressure, liquid pressure, just like the brake lines in your car, inside that hollow point cavity. And so pressure inside that hollow point pushes the sides of the bullet open, and it comes open like this. So if I take my hands and make the model bigger for you, the jacketing material, the copper jacketing material that's facing forward as the bullet travels, when it encounters something liquid and expands, some people like the term mushroom, I don't hear that term, but when it expands or encounters soft damage, pressure builds up, and so that jacketing that was facing forward actually peels backwards, down, and around, but it leaves you with a forward-facing area of the projectile that's greater than the original caliber. Mushroom, so you get greater surface area presented to the way it's going. And when you do that, you increase drag. And when you increase drag, you decelerate or slow that bullet down more quickly. And so these bullets undergo, or created through intense engineering by people at the companies, such that they go a preferred depth in tissue or tissue simulant. So the main reason for hollow points in handgun in particular, whether that's somebody in law enforcement or somebody interested in protecting themselves, as opposed to going to, say, the range, would be to control penetration depth. So this bullet will stay in one body, and you don't over-penetrate and go through further. And I work cases that have non-expanding bullets, often called full metal jackets. Typically, you can see over-penetration. You can go clean through one person and on into another. So that's the hollow point cavity mechanism.
Any bullets, in this case, are Hague.
From my review, there were 4 fired cartridge casings and 4 projectiles and 1 small lead fragment that were recovered. And we can kind of go through these because this brings into play a term called the limited universe, meaning we limit our options. We take pieces of that puzzle off the table and put them in their place. So for example, 1 bullet was recovered at autopsy. The entrance gunshot wound was listed as over here on the right chest, as I recall, and the bullet was recovered in the back of the decedent. That bullet, in my examination, shows soft damage, expansion, just as I would expect from bullets of this type. That bullet's wound path in the torso is well documented, and so we can kind of take 1 of 4 off the table, in that the entrance hole hole, primarily for me in the shirt, is a nice round hole indicating that it was not unstable tumbling before it got there. This is basically a nice stable bullet entry, and that bullet was recovered there. So that's 1 of 4. Another bullet was recovered after going through one of the walls of the bedroom and through several cabinets into a bathroom area. And under examination, when I looked at that bullet, it initially looked mushroomed, which is why I'm not a fan of that term, because it had the visual appearance of it, but it was just deformed. Instead of the jacketing material unfolding as I described before, how bullets do in tissue, it was just collapsed. So if you see pictures of this bullet, which as I recall, this is bullet number 11 in the crime scene images, I believe. While it looks fairly mushroomed, it does not demonstrate soft damage, and the hole going into the bedroom wall is again a nice round hole, indicating that that bullet was stable when it struck the wall, had not struck something else first. So that's 2 of our 4 bullets that are sort of off the table, and we kind of know somewhat what their story is. A third bullet was recovered down a hallway from the bedroom and in a wall. And other crime scene images indicate that it had gone through things like a book, I believe a part of a mattress, and maybe a book holder before it got to the wall where it was recovered. Examination of this bullet was very interesting in that it shows no signs of any sort of soft damage or even mushrooming of the nose. The nose is in its basically initial condition. But it has a very classic and typical characteristic to it that I demonstrate in my recon classes when I ricochet bullets off materials at shallow angles. So when I say ricochet, I mean the bullet came in at a shallow angle and continued on along its path. It's a flat spot on the ogive is the part of the bullet we're going to talk about. It's the rounded part from the nose down towards what's called the bearing surface or the cylindrical portion of the bullet. So it's a big flat spot because things like tile, what we describe as unyielding surfaces, meaning they don't give, the bullet takes up the damage, create those flat spots. In addition to that, when you look at the flat spot, you see scratches or stria on it from dynamic interaction with the surface, and those lines go straight from the nose to the base. That tells me this bullet, when it struck tile, is the likely thing in this scenario, the floor, it was stable. It was going nose first to get that flat spot and be scratched directly from the nose to the base. It then continued on down range and was stuck in the wall. That bullet gives us some idea of some trajectory, even though it's stuck in a wall just barely. You can, in crime scene images, see it stuck in the soft drywall because it's downrange from the bedroom where all of the fired cartridge casings, biological matter on the floor is. But that hallway gives us sort of a path, trough, that the bullet had to have passed through. There were no other documented impact sites in that area, so we have what's called ballistic accessibility. It creates a path into the bedroom area. If we assume that's where the firearm was, which is a logical assumption in my opinion, based on the cartridge casings, the biological material, that doesn't overlap with another trajectory. I'll come back to that in a second. Our fourth bullet is found on the floor in the bedroom, in the middle of the floor. Its position to me does not really mean much because it's laying there just on the floor where it could have been kicked, could have been moved slightly, so we don't know where else it might have struck in that room. But the key thing about this bullet, this is bullet number 5 as I recall, is that it does show soft damage. It is expanded. In the images you would see the jacketing material is peeled directly back and is facing rearward. The damage to this bullet tells me it went through tissue, something soft and liquidy, not things like wood and drywall or glass, but rather tissue. In this case is our limited universe option. So this bullet, number 5, would have had to have gone through the gunshot wound to the leg, which as I recall enters on the interior left portion of the leg and exits out to the right side of the leg itself. So those 4 bullets, and each one has a story to tell about what it did or did not strike.
When you speak of tissue, we're speaking about tissue of your body.
I am.
So bring with a slide diagram.
I have 2 things that fit that bill. I have the Manatee County's 3D scan data with trajectories for one shot that I could show, as well as images I took of the 4 projectiles that I just mentioned that would help illustrate my points if you need to.
All right, we'll get to that. Just finish up half. I'd like to ask about half shot chest. Are you able to say, based upon your training experience and education, whether or not that where the shoot relative to that?
Of course, I wasn't there for the autopsy, but experts rely on each other's reports in order to formulate opinions. The entrance is generally on the right, front side of the chest here. The bullets recovered in the back left area. Because bullets of this type, expanding handgun bullets, travel in relatively straight lines when they go into tissue. If you simply extrapolate those lines from the autopsy report, it gives you an idea of where the firearm was. I typically speak in terms of the firearm itself as opposed to a person. Of course, a firearm is just a machine, so it typically has an operator. So how that person is directly placed with the firearm is beyond my physical evidence examination ability. But the firearm, if you put a line straight back from where the bullet entered to where it went, it gives us our best approximation of where then a firearm would have been at the time that shot was fired. Again, that snapshot in time.
Are you able to reach any order of shots?
There's nothing in this from the physical evidence standpoint that allows me to sequence these shots 1 through 4. If one starts to make assumptions, which some people recoil at the word assumption, as long as you have a legitimate reason for saying the word assumption or are willing to describe its validity, we make assumptions in science all the time. It allows us to make further steps. So, for example, we have 2 trajectories through the body. We have 2 trajectories into objects into the crime scene. If I look at the trajectories just within the crime scene, one that has to go through that long hallway and one that we actually do have some data for to figure out where the firearm was that just goes into the wall within the bedroom, and we look at those 2 trajectories, they don't overlap, meaning there's not a physical possibility for the firearm to have been stationary between just those 2 shots. I can't tell you, with regard to sequencing, which one was first, but if you make an assumption that the firearm, if you're the firearm, I meant right to left, moved from right to left, then the one down the hallway would have to have been before the one into the wall, if that's the hypothesis. If we take the opposite hypothesis, it's opposite left to right. That's where witness statements come into play to evaluate whether or not the physical evidence supports or refutes a witness statement. You never take a witness statement, and in my line of work, believe it. You look into what the physical evidence supports and then cross-compare them. So if you have information or an opinion or a statement that the firearm was indeed in motion from right to left, the physical evidence for those 2 trajectories would support that. As far as the body, for me, this case doesn't help too much because I focus more on the scene in this case. Others have focused on the body. But with regard to the scene itself, with the body itself, certainly we have an idea of where the firearm was relative to that body, but because those bullets don't then continue on to hit other things within the scene, I don't particularly have an opinion there that would lead me to allow me to then say sequence those in order.
Do you have an opinion as whether or not cease was stationary or...
If we assume that the firearm was relatively stationary, and by that I don't mean a matter of 3 or 4 feet, I mean the firearm is not circling about the room, going out in the hallway of this incident or otherwise. If we take the position that the firearm is generally just in the bedroom and is pointed in the same relative direction as the 2 trajectories that I've described for you, then it would have to be that the decedent was in motion, because we have trajectories in the decedent's body that are almost opposing. We have one that goes from, as described in the autopsy report, and this is how it's commonly described in such things, front to back, right to left, and as I recall, relatively flat. I think it was maybe slightly downward, but I've forgotten the vertical component. But the key factor is that one goes this way, and as I read the autopsy report, the other gunshot wound enters the inside of the right leg and comes out the exterior outside of the right leg. These are basically 2 relatively opposing trajectories on an object that undeniably, in my work, objects, bodies, regularly move in between shots for one reason or another. So given that, to me, those trajectories in the body indicate to me that the body was in motion.
All right, and with respect to firearm itself, are you able to draw any conclusion whether or not that was well?
Certainly within the degree I've described before with the 2 trajectories that I can show you, the one that goes in the wall, for those that I can demonstrate by physical evidence, there was some motion. And as I recall from my measurements in the 3D scan data, it's something like 4 or 5 feet, at least, from one position of one trajectory's area over into the area of the other. As an approximation, again, because, again, trajectories are approximations. Otherwise, beyond that, no.
So would it safe to say that support act that both ceased well and had from right left?
I can't tell you that the firearm moved from right to left at those shots. A statement of such would be supported by those 2 trajectories that I mentioned.
All right, please demonstrate for us now. Slides.
Sure, it'll take me just a minute to set up the laptop.
Yeah, thank you.
More continuing coverage is on the way. The Black Swan murder trial of Ashley Benefield from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Press subscribe now.